Captain Darek Volar sat at the corner of the bar, quietly savoring his drink, while cadets and civilians filled the room with the old war songs of the United Coalition. He had served for almost 80 galactic years, fighting in countless battles across the stars. He had risen through the ranks, eventually leading entire brigades and earning himself the title of captain. After all that time, the Coalition offered him a chance to retire or to teach at the academy. He chose the latter. In many ways, it was his way of staying connected to the only life he had ever known. Most nights, he drank alone. His large frame and rugged appearance were intimidating enough that cadets kept their distance. Standing close to 3 meters tall, Darek was a giant among them. Scars from old wounds crisscrossed his arms and face, reminders of the battles that had shaped him. But tonight, one cadet, urged on by his friends, worked up the courage to approach. "Captain Volar," the cadet began hesitantly. "We were talking, and we wondered, who were the greatest soldiers you've fought with?" Darek looked at the young man, noting the earnestness in his face. He took a long sip from his glass, considering the question. "The greatest soldiers, you say?" His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that silenced those nearby. "They weren't from our coalition. No, the greatest soldiers I fought with were humans." The cadet's eyes widened, and a hush fell over the room as Darek continued. "It was 30 cycles ago during the Raka invasion. The Raka were unlike any enemy we'd ever faced. They were enormous, almost as tall as me, but with a serpentine lower body. They moved in a way that no other species could, gliding over the ground with a deadly grace. Their skin was covered in scales hard enough to deflect most plasma fire, and their backs bristled with venomous spines that could paralyze with a single touch." He paused, letting the cadet imagine these monstrous creatures. "They were ruthless. To the Raka, other species were either food or slaves. They came from a part of space so far out, it hadn't even been charted. We didn't know who they were or where they came from, just that they destroyed everything in their path. They hit one of our outer colonies first, leveling it within hours. There was nothing left but ruins when our forces arrived. They left us a message: surrender or be destroyed." Darek's gaze grew distant as he continued. "The Coalition didn't take the threat seriously. They thought a small fleet would be enough to handle it. But when our ships arrived, they found themselves vastly outnumbered. Hundreds of Raka capital ships, thousands of escorts, and what looked like troop carriers. Not a single ship made it back to us. When we learned the true scale of their forces, we knew we were in trouble." He glanced around the room, noticing how the cadets had inched closer, their faces reflecting a mix of fascination and dread. "Our fleets were scattered across the galaxy, and it would take time to bring them together. So, we had no choice but to buy time. The Coalition ordered the evacuation of every colony in the Raka's path, and I was assigned to Mera IV, a small outpost. Only about 5,000 civilians. They gave me a force of 15,000 troops and told me to hold out for as long as I could. I thought it would be enough." Darek took another drink, his eyes darkening. "But the Raka came with a force of thousands. They hit us with everything they had. I remember the sound of their advance, a low rumble like thunder, growing louder until it felt like the ground would crack open. Plasma fire barely slowed them, and they tore through our lines like we weren't even there. We fought with everything we had, but it wasn't enough. We were being overrun." The cadet, sitting closest to him, leaned forward, captivated by every word. "What did you do, sir?" Darek's expression softened slightly as he answered. "I thought we were finished. But then Out of nowhere, a human fleet appeared. Just a small patrol, 6 ships passing through nearby space. They picked up our distress signal and jumped in without a second thought. They hit the Raka from the side, catching them off guard. It was the first time I'd seen humans in combat, and I was taken aback by how they fought. He took another sip, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. They were smaller than us, and they didn't have our armor or our strength. But they had something else. They wore black armor and carried weapons I'd never seen before. Explosive projectiles that tore through the Raka's scales like they were nothing. The humans landed, ferrying our people off-world while holding the line against the Raka. They were relentless. Their leader, Captain Lance, introduced himself to me after the first wave. I thanked him, but he just nodded, as if it were all part of his day's work. He paused, the smile fading. The Raka attacked us again and again, but the humans stood their ground. For days, they held with us, repelling every assault. They didn't flinch, and they didn't back down. I remember one moment vividly. Captain Lance ordered an orbital strike on his own position to keep the Raka from breaking through. I asked him why he'd do such a thing, and he simply said, "Sometimes the few must fall so that the many can live." He and his men stayed behind, knowing what it meant. Darek took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he remembered. After Captain Lance and his men held that line, we were able to get most of our people off-world, but the cost was high. I watched as they stayed behind, fighting until the last moment, and we lifted off just as the Raka overwhelmed their position. It's a memory that still haunts me. Seeing them down there, giving everything so that others could escape. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the cadets. I lost count of how many times we had to repel the Raka over those few days. Each attack felt more desperate than the last, and every time, more of my men fell. It became clear that we couldn't hold them off forever. The humans who stayed with us were tireless, fighting with a tenacity I'd never seen, even among our own forces. They didn't have to be there. They could have withdrawn with the rest. But they chose to stay and fight. Darek glanced around the room, noting how the young cadets were listening intently, their expressions a mix of admiration and sorrow. We fought through the night, barely holding the line. I remember seeing the look in my men's eyes, the exhaustion, the fear, and yet they stood firm. They were inspired by the humans, by Captain Lance's sacrifice. It was as if that moment had changed them, made them willing to give just as much, to stand their ground, no matter what. He took a long sip from his drink, his gaze distant as he recalled the final hours. Eventually, we received word from the fleet. Reinforcements were on their way, but we had to hold for just a little longer. The Raka kept coming, and I could feel the desperation in their attacks. They knew they were running out of time, just as we were. Our last line of defense was a narrow ridge, the only position left before the landing zone. I gathered the remaining troops and we dug in, knowing this was it. One of the cadets shifted uncomfortably, his eyes wide. "Did the reinforcements make it in time, sir?" Darek's face softened, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Barely. We held that ridge for what felt like an eternity. The humans had set up a pair of railguns, and I can still remember the sound, an endless barrage of fire tearing through the Raka as they advanced. The ground was littered with their bodies, but they kept coming. It was a relentless, almost surreal sight. I remember one of the human soldiers, a young woman, yelling out that they'd take every last one of them if they had to. He paused, taking another drink. Just when I thought we'd be overrun, Our ships appeared on the horizon, the sky lit up with laser fire as they cut through the Raka's rear lines, buying us the time we needed. We signaled the retreat, and the last of the shuttles started lifting off. I stayed until the final moment, watching as the humans covered our exit, never once backing down. Darek looked around the room, his eyes meeting each cadet's gaze in turn. We barely made it out. By the time we reached orbit, we'd lost nearly half our force. But thanks to the humans, we were alive. When we finally docked with the fleet, I asked the human pilot what had driven them to stay, why they'd risked everything for us. He looked at me and said, "Because we don't leave people behind. Not if we can help it." That's something I'll never forget. He set his glass down, the room silent around him. They taught me something that day. Strength isn't just about size or firepower. It's about heart, about the willingness to stand for something greater than yourself. I've fought alongside many soldiers in my time, but none like them. Those humans showed me what it truly means to be a warrior. As Darek stood to leave, he looked back at the cadet who had first approached him. "Remember what I've told you tonight. One day, you'll find yourself facing something that seems impossible. When that time comes, think of Captain Lance and his men. Remember their courage, and know that you can find that same strength within yourself." With that, Captain Darek Volar turned and walked out of the bar, leaving the cadets to sit in stunned silence, reflecting on the story they had just heard. They knew that his words would stay with them, echoing in their minds as they prepared for the challenges that lay ahead.